A cold millionaire sees a disabled girl teaching his mute son to speak, but when he learns her last name, he faints. What happens next will change all their lives forever. This is a story about unexpected connections, the power of healing, and how sometimes the people we least expect can teach us the most important lessons about love and family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost clung to the massive windows of the Sterling mansion as Alexander Sterling adjusted his platinum cufflinks with mechanical precision. At 38, he commanded Sterling Pharmaceutical with an iron fist that had earned him billions and a reputation as one of Boston's most ruthless businessmen. His steel-grey eyes reflected the same coldness as the November morning outside his corner office on the 42nd floor of Sterling Tower. Alexander's daily routine was clockwork precision. 5 a.m. workout, protein shake, financial reports over coffee that cost more per pound than most people's monthly groceries. By 7:30, his driver Marcus would have the Bentley waiting. By 8, he'd be reviewing quarterly projections that would determine the fate of thousands of employees he'd never meet. But today felt different. Today marked exactly 3 years since the accident that had stolen his wife Elena's voice forever, and with it, any warmth Alexander had possessed. The Sterling mansion sat on 12 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in Beacon Hill, a monument to wealth that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Each room was designed by the finest architects, filled with priceless art, yet echoed with a silence so profound it seemed to have weight. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly housekeeper who'd worked for the family for 15 years, moved through the halls like a ghost, speaking only when necessary and always in hushed tones. At the heart of this fortress lived 8-year-old Ethan Sterling, Alexander's son. The boy possessed his father's piercing blue eyes and his mother's delicate features. But where Elena had once filled rooms with laughter and music, Ethan hadn't spoken a single word since witnessing his mother's fatal car accident 3 years prior. The trauma had locked away his voice as surely as grief had frozen his father's heart. Dr. Patricia Marsh, the latest in a series of expensive therapists, sat across from Alexander in his mahogany-paneled study. Her credentials were impeccable. Harvard Medical School, 20 years specializing in childhood trauma, a client list that read like a who's who of Boston society. Yet her expression carried the same defeat that had marked her predecessors. "Mr. Sterling," she began carefully, her leather portfolio closed on her lap, "I've exhausted every traditional approach with Ethan. He's extraordinarily intelligent, shows perfect comprehension, but the selective mutism appears deeply entrenched." Alexander's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Are you telling me you're giving up, Dr. Marsh?" "Not giving up," she replied, choosing her words with surgical precision. "But I believe Ethan needs something I cannot provide. Traditional therapy. In sterile environments isn't reaching him. He needs authentic connection, natural interaction with peers." "Ethan attends the finest private academy in the state," Alexander stated flatly. "He's surrounded by children from the best families." Dr. Marsh leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Sterling, with respect, Ethan sits alone during every recess. His teachers report he observes, but never participates. The other children have learned not to approach him. He's isolated despite being surrounded by people." The observation hit closer to home than Alexander cared to admit. The same could be said about his own existence, surrounded by employees, associates, board members, yet fundamentally alone since Elena's death. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Alexander asked, his tone carrying the edge that made seasoned executives scramble for cover. "There's a community program at Riverside Elementary," Dr. Marsh explained, pulling a brochure from her portfolio. It's not what you'd typically consider, but they have remarkable success with special needs integration. Children helping children, natural peer interaction. Alexander glanced at the colorful brochure with unconcealed disdain. Riverside Elementary sat in Millfield, a working-class neighborhood 40 minutes from Beacon Hill. The building looked tired, the playground equipment basic. The whole facility a stark contrast to Ethan's current school, where tuition costs more than most people's annual salaries. "You're suggesting I send my son to a public school?" The disgust in Alexander's voice was palpable. "I'm suggesting Ethan needs what money can't buy," Dr. Marsh replied firmly. "Genuine human connection. At Riverside, there's a girl named Sophie Martinez who works with nonverbal children. She's 12, has cerebral palsy that affects her mobility, but she has an extraordinary gift for reaching kids like Ethan." Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked his perfectly landscaped grounds. "A disabled child is going to help my son when Harvard-trained professionals have failed. Sometimes healing comes from unexpected places, Mr. Sterling. Sophie doesn't see barriers the way adults do. To her, Ethan wouldn't be a case study or a challenge to solve. He'd simply be another kid who needs a friend." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the antique grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Eleanor's parents that Alexander could never bring himself to remove, despite how its chiming marked each empty hour. "The program runs every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon," Dr. Marsh continued. "Just 2 hours. You could try it for a month and see if there's any progress." Alexander's reflection stared back at him from the window, a man who'd built an empire on calculated risks and strategic decisions. Yet the thought of his son in a public school environment, vulnerable and exposed, triggered protective instincts that warred with his desperation for any solution. "Ethan's security would be completely unnecessary," Dr. Marsh interrupted gently. "The program is supervised. The school has excellent safety protocols. And frankly, Mr. Sterling, Ethan needs to experience normalcy, not live in a fortress." That evening, Alexander found himself in Ethan's room, a space that reflected both immense privilege and profound sadness. The boy sat by his window, sketching in one of dozens of art books that lined his shelves. His drawings were extraordinary for an 8-year-old, detailed, emotional, complex scenes that revealed an inner world his voice couldn't express. Ethan looked up as his father entered, those blue eyes so like Eleanor's, holding a mixture of hope and wariness that broke Alexander's heart. The boy had learned to read his father's moods with uncanny accuracy, understanding that good news was rare in their silent household. "Dr. Marsh thinks you might benefit from a different kind of program," Alexander said, sitting on the edge of Ethan's bed. "With other children who understand what it's like to face challenges." Ethan tilted his head, curiosity replacing wariness. Alexander pulled out his phone, showing photos of Riverside Elementary that he'd researched after Dr. Marsh left. The boy studied the images intently. Children playing together, laughing, engaged in activities that looked nothing like the structured, formal environment of his current school. "Would you like to try something new?" Alexander asked softly, using the gentle tone he reserved only for these private moments with his son. Ethan's response was a slow nod, followed by something that made Alexander's breath catch, a small smile, the first genuine expression of interest he'd seen from his son in months. 2 days later, Marcus pulled the Bentley up to Riverside Elementary during the afternoon pickup time. The contrast with Beacon Hill Academy was jarring. Where Ethan's current school featured stone facades and manicured lawns, Riverside was red brick and chain-link fencing. Parents arrived in minivans and aging sedans instead of luxury vehicles, and children spilled from the building with an energy and casualness that felt almost foreign. Alexander stepped out of the car, immediately drawing curious glances from Other parents, his custom-tailored suit and expensive watch, marked him as clearly as if he wore a sign declaring his net worth. Beside him, Ethan pressed closer, intimidated by the chaos of normal childhood that surrounded them. "Mr. Sterling," a warm voice called from the school entrance. Principal Janet Foster approached with the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years in public education. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair and kind eyes that assessed without judgment. "Dr. Marsh told me to expect you. I'm excited to show you our program." As they walked through corridors lined with student artwork and achievement certificates, Alexander found himself analyzing every detail with the same scrutiny he applied to potential business acquisitions. The floors were clean but worn, the walls painted in cheerful colors that couldn't quite hide their age, the classroom technology functional but outdated. "Our special integration program happens in the multi-purpose room," Principal Foster explained, leading them past classrooms where teachers engaged with students in ways that seemed more relaxed and interactive than Ethan's current academic environment. "We've found that mixed-age groups work better than traditional grade divisions. Children learn from each other in ways adults sometimes can't facilitate." They paused outside a room filled with activity. Through the window, Alexander could see perhaps 20 children of various ages engaged in different stations, some working on puzzles, others drawing, a few gathered around what appeared to be a reading circle. What struck him immediately was the natural way children with different abilities interacted, no artificial boundaries or institutional feeling. "There she is," Principal Foster said softly, pointing to a corner where a girl sat cross-legged on a colorful mat. "Sophie Martinez." Alexander's first impression was of determination personified. Sophie appeared to be 12, with long dark hair and expressive brown eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. Her left leg was braced, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to navigate physical challenges with grace and intelligence. But what captivated Alexander was what Sophie was doing. A boy, roughly Ethan's age, sat across from her, his posture suggesting he was non-verbal like Ethan. Sophie had a collection of picture cards spread between them, but instead of the clinical approach Alexander had seen in therapy sessions, she was making the interaction into a game. She'd hold up a card, make an exaggerated facial expression, then wait patiently for the boy's response. When he pointed or gestured, she celebrated as if he'd just solved a complex mathematical equation. Sophie lost her father in Afghanistan 2 years ago, Principal Foster explained quietly. Her mother Carmen works 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Sophie's been in our program since she was 7, originally as a participant, but we quickly realized she had an extraordinary gift for connecting with children who struggle with communication. Ethan pressed against the window, his eyes fixed on Sophie with an intensity Alexander hadn't seen since before Elena's death. There was something magnetic about the girl's approach, patient but playful, structured but natural. She treated each small breakthrough like a miracle, while maintaining an environment that felt safe and encouraging. "She's not a trained therapist," Alexander observed, though his tone lacked its usual dismissive edge. "No," Principal Foster agreed, "but sometimes the best teachers are those who understand struggle firsthand. Sophie knows what it's like to feel different, to face challenges others don't understand. That empathy creates connections that textbook knowledge can't replicate." As they watched, another child approached Sophie's circle, this one clearly dealing with autism based on his repetitive movements and difficulty making eye contact. Without missing a beat, Sophie adjusted her approach, incorporating his movements into a rhythm game that made his behaviors part of the activity rather than obstacles to overcome. How does she know what to do? Alexander found himself asking. Intuition, experience, and a heart bigger than most adults I know, Principal Foster replied. Sophie doesn't see disabilities, she sees potential. To her, every child is just waiting for the right key to unlock their voice, whether that voice is verbal or not. Ethan tugged gently on his father's jacket, pointing into the room with an expression of longing that broke Alexander's carefully. Maintained composure. His son wanted to be part of what they were witnessing, the natural, joyful interaction that had been missing from his structured, isolated existence. "Could we meet her?" Alexander heard himself asking, surprising both Principal Foster and himself. Of course, Sophie loves meeting new friends. As they entered the room, the noise level dropped slightly as children noticed the unfamiliar adult in the expensive suit. But Sophie's attention remained focused on the child she was working with, demonstrating the kind of concentration and dedication that impressed Alexander despite his skepticism. "Sophie," Principal Foster called gently, "there's someone I'd like you to meet." The girl looked up, her smile immediate and genuine. She moved carefully from her seated position, using her hands for support, and approached them with the confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin, despite her physical challenges. "Hi there," Sophie said directly to Ethan, ignoring Alexander. "Entirely. I'm Sophie. What's your name?" Ethan stepped closer to his father, overwhelmed by direct attention from a peer. He looked up at Alexander, seeking permission or reassurance. "This is Ethan," Alexander answered for his son. "He's considering joining your program." Sophie tilted her head, studying Ethan with the kind of direct, unself-conscious assessment that only children can manage. "Do you like to draw?" she asked Ethan. "I saw you looking at our art station. We have really good markers, and Tommy over there makes the coolest dragons." Ethan nodded slowly, the first direct response he'd given to a child in years. "Want to see?" Sophie asked, already moving toward the art area with the assumption that Ethan would follow. Alexander watched his son make a choice, stay safe beside his father or venture into unknown social territory. After a moment of hesitation, Ethan took a tentative step after Sophie, then another, until he was walking beside her toward a table covered with art supplies and half-finished projects. "She has a gift," Principal Foster murmured as they observed. From a distance, Sophie sees past the surface to what children need. She's been invaluable in our program. At the art table, Sophie introduced Ethan to Tommy, a boy with Down syndrome who was indeed creating an elaborate dragon drawing. Without any awkwardness or special explanation, Sophie simply included Ethan in their conversation, asking his opinion on color choices and design elements. Within minutes, Ethan was holding a marker, adding small details to Tommy's dragon, while Sophie narrated their collaborative effort with enthusiasm that made both boys smile. Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Elena's death. Watching his son interact naturally with other children, seeing him smile and engage without fear or pressure, created a hope he'd thought permanently buried. But as the session continued, and Alexander observed Sophie's interactions with various children, a nagging familiarity began to surface. Something about her mannerisms, the way she tilted her head when concentrating, the shape of her eyes when she smiled, details that triggered memories he couldn't quite place. When pickup time arrived and parents began collecting their children, Alexander approached Sophie to thank her for including Ethan. She was packing her materials with the efficient movements of someone far older than 12. "Ethan's really nice," Sophie told Alexander, with the directness of childhood. "He understands things even when he doesn't talk. Some kids are like that. They think in pictures instead of words." "You seem to understand children very well," Alexander replied, genuinely impressed by her insight. Sophie shrugged with characteristic preteen modesty. "My mom says people just need someone to really see them. That's what I try to do." At that moment, a tired-looking woman approached. Clearly Sophie's mother based on their shared features. Carmen Martinez appeared to be in her mid-30s, wearing scrubs that suggested she'd come directly from a medical job. Despite obvious exhaustion, her smile for Sophie was radiant with love and pride. "How was today, Mija?" Carmen asked, helping Sophie gather her things. "Really good, Mom. I met Ethan. He's going to join our group. He makes really cool art." Carmen looked up at Alexander, and he saw in her eyes the same strength and determination that characterized her daughter. She was beautiful, in an understated way, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair that spoke of someone who'd faced significant challenges while maintaining grace and dignity. "Carmen Martinez," she introduced herself, extending her hand. "You must be Ethan's father. Sophie mentioned he might be joining our program." "Alexander Sterling," he replied, shaking her hand and noticing the calluses that spoke of hard work and sacrifice. At the mention of his last name, Carmen's expression changed subtly. A flicker of recognition, followed quickly by something that looked like shock. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled it back and color drained from her face. "Sterling," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Alexander confirmed, puzzled by her reaction. "Alexander Sterling of Sterling. Pharmaceutical!" Carmen's eyes widened, and she gripped Sophie's shoulder for support. The recognition in her expression was unmistakable, though Alexander couldn't understand its source or intensity. "Mom?" Sophie asked, concerned by her mother's sudden change in demeanor. "Are you okay?" Carmen recovered quickly, the practiced resilience of someone accustomed to hiding difficulties from her child. "Fine, sweetheart. Just tired from work." But as they prepared to leave, Alexander noticed Carmen's hands shaking as she helped Sophie with her backpack. Whatever his name had triggered, it went far deeper than simple recognition of his business reputation. The drive home was silent, except for Ethan's occasional excited gestures as he replayed the afternoon's activities. For the first time in years, Alexander's son seemed genuinely happy, energized by social interaction and the promise of returning to the program. But Alexander's mind was occupied with Carmen Martinez's reaction to his name. The shock in her eyes suggested a connection far more personal than professional recognition. As they pulled into the circular drive of the Sterling mansion, he made a mental note to investigate the Martinez family background, a decision that would prove to change everything he thought he knew about his past, his present, and the intricate connections that bind human lives together in ways that defy understanding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Sterling Pharmaceutical corporate headquarters gleamed in the early morning sun as Alexander stepped from his Bentley, his mind still replaying Carmen Martinez's startling reaction to his name. 3 days had passed since Ethan's first visit to Riverside Elementary, and the boy had asked repeatedly when he could return, the most communication he'd attempted in months. Alexander's executive assistant, Victoria Chen, greeted him with the usual stack of urgent documents and a detailed schedule that would keep him occupied until well past dinner. But today he had a different priority. "Victoria, I need you to run a comprehensive background check on someone," Alexander said, settling behind his mahogany desk that overlooked the Boston Harbor. "Carmen Martinez works in the medical field, has a daughter named Sophie. I want everything. Employment, history, medical records, family background, educational records." Victoria raised an eyebrow, but made notes without question. After 8 years as Alexander's right hand, she'd learned that his requests, however unusual, always had strategic importance. "How far back should I go?" 20 years, Alexander replied, then paused. "Actually, make it 25. As Victoria left to initiate the investigation, Alexander found himself staring out at the harbor, his thoughts drifting to memories he'd buried deep. Carmen's reaction had been too visceral, too immediate to be coincidental. The way she'd gripped Sophie's shoulder, the color draining from her face, it suggested a connection that went beyond mere recognition of his corporate reputation. His intercom buzzed. "Mr. Sterling, your 10 o'clock is here. The board meeting. About the pediatric drug trials." Alexander forced his attention back to business. Sterling Pharmaceutical was on the verge of breakthrough treatments for childhood neurological disorders, ironically appropriate given Ethan's current situation. As he entered the conference room, his mind should have been focused on profit, margins, and FDA approval timelines. Instead, he found himself thinking about a 12-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who seemed to understand his son better than any trained professional. The meeting progressed with typical corporate efficiency. Charts and graphs displayed promising trial results, legal representatives outlined regulatory pathways, and financial projections painted rosy pictures of future revenues. But when Dr. Sarah Kellerman, head of pediatric research, mentioned the challenges of reaching non-verbal children in their studies, Alexander's attention sharpened. "We're having difficulty establishing baseline communications with several participants," Dr. Kellerman explained, clicking through slides showing children who bore striking resemblances to Ethan's struggles. "Traditional assessment methods aren't effective with selective mutism cases. What about alternative approaches?" Alexander found himself asking. "Peer interaction, play therapy, non-clinical environments?" The room fell silent. Alexander Sterling, asking about alternative therapeutic approaches, was like a shark inquiring about vegetarianism, so far outside his usual concerns that his board members exchanged puzzled glances. "Sir?" Dr. Kellerman prompted carefully. Alexander cleared his throat, reasserting his professional demeanor. "I'm simply suggesting we consider all methodologies to ensure accurate data collection." But as the meeting continued, Alexander's thoughts kept returning to Sophie Martinez and her intuitive approach to communication barriers. There was something profound in her methods that clinical trials and pharmaceutical interventions couldn't replicate. Human connection unburdened by professional limitations or scientific protocols. That afternoon, Victoria knocked on his office door with a thick manila folder. "The Martinez investigation," she announced, setting it on his desk with the efficiency that made her invaluable. Alexander opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly, an unusual physical manifestation of anxiety he rarely experienced in business contexts. The first documents were routine. Carmen Martinez, 34 years old, employed as a certified nursing assistant at Boston General Hospital, previous employment at several medical facilities, consistently positive reviews, no criminal background. But as he delved deeper, details began forming a picture that made his chest tighten with growing recognition. Carmen Elena Vasquez, her maiden name was Elena, born in San Antonio, Texas, moved to Boston in 2010, father deceased, mother living in a nursing facility with advanced dementia. Alexander's breathing became shallow as he turned pages that revealed more personal information. Carmen had been married briefly to Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez, killed in Afghanistan in 2021. One daughter, Sophie Elena Martinez, born 2012. Medical records indicated Sophie's cerebral palsy resulted from complications during premature birth. Then, he found the photograph that made everything click into place. It was a hospital ID from 2009, showing a younger Carmen working as a student nurse. But it wasn't her appearance that made Alexander's hands shake. It was the notation in her employment file. "Emergency contact, Elena Sterling, sister." The folder slipped from his numb fingers, papers scattering across his desk. Elena Sterling, his wife, had a sister named Carmen. Carmen Elena Vasquez, who had taken her husband's surname Martinez after marriage, who now went by Carmen Martinez. Sophie was Elena's niece. his wife's sister's daughter. Alexander's vision blurred as 15 years of memory came flooding back. Elena had spoken of her younger sister Carmen, the nursing student who'd been working in Texas while Elena and Alexander had been building their life in Boston. Family tensions had kept the sisters apart. Their parents had disapproved of Elena's marriage to a wealthy Anglo businessman, viewing it as a betrayal of their cultural roots. The last contact between the sisters had been shortly before Ethan's birth, when Carmen had called to congratulate them. But Elena's parents had demanded she choose between their approval and maintaining a relationship with Carmen, who they felt represented the family values Elena had abandoned. In a decision that haunted Elena for years, she had chosen Alexander and their new family, cutting contact with her sister to preserve peace with their parents. Elena had died believing she'd lost her sister forever, never knowing that Carmen had moved to Boston, never knowing about Sophie's existence, never knowing that her niece was growing up just 40 miles from where Elena lived in isolation from her own blood family. Alexander stumbled to his private bathroom and stared at himself. In the mirror, his face was pale, his usually perfect hair disheveled. The man looking back at him was a stranger, someone whose carefully constructed world had just been revealed as built on incomplete foundations. Carmen Martinez knew exactly who he was. She had recognized the Sterling name because her sister had been Elena Sterling. Sophie's mysterious gift for understanding children like Ethan wasn't just professional intuition, it was familial connection, the same empathy and insight that had made Elena such an extraordinary mother before the accident stole her voice. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Ready for pickup to Riverside Elementary? He had completely forgotten. Today was Thursday, Ethan's second session with the integration program. The boy had been looking forward to it all week, asking repeatedly if he could see Sophie again. As Alexander rode to the school, his mind raced through implications and possibilities. Carmen's shock at hearing his name hadn't been random recognition. It had been the realization that her sister's widower was standing before her, that Elena's son was the child her daughter had been helping. But why hadn't she said anything? Why maintain the pretense of being strangers when she could have revealed their connection immediately? The answer came to him as Marcus pulled into Riverside Elementary's parking lot. Carmen was protecting Sophie from potential disappointment and loss. She had learned, perhaps from Elena's own experience, that connections with the Sterling family could be complicated and painful. Rather than risk her daughter's emotional investment in a relationship that might prove temporary, Carmen was maintaining careful distance while allowing Sophie to help Ethan on purely professional grounds. Inside the school, Alexander found himself studying Carmen Martinez with new eyes as she helped Sophie settle into the activity area. The resemblance to Elena was subtle, but unmistakable once he knew to look for it. The way she tilted her head when listening, the graceful movement of her hands when she spoke, the unconscious habit of tucking hair behind her left ear when concentrating. Mr. Sterling, Principal Foster approached with her usual warm professionalism. Ethan seemed excited about returning today. Alexander nodded absently, his attention focused on the developing interaction between Sophie and his son. Today, Sophie had prepared what appeared to be a communication board, pictures and symbols arranged in patterns that allowed non-verbal children to express complex ideas through pointing and gesturing. But more remarkable was the natural ease with which she engaged Ethan. There was no clinical distance, no therapeutic methodology, just one child patiently helping another find ways to share his inner world. When Ethan pointed to a picture of a house, Sophie didn't simply acknowledge his choice. Instead, she began building a story around it, encouraging him to add details through additional selections that gradually revealed his thoughts and feelings. Sophie has a special connection with Ethan, Principal Foster observed, following Alexander's gaze. Sometimes I think she understands what he's trying to communicate before he knows it himself." The comment carried more truth than the principal realized. Sophie's understanding of Ethan wasn't just therapeutic intuition. It was the result of shared DNA, inherited empathy, and the mysterious connections that link family members across time and circumstance. As the session progressed, Alexander watched Carmen observe her daughter's work with quiet pride. There was something profoundly moving about witnessing a mother who had clearly sacrificed enormously to provide her disabled daughter with opportunities for growth and service to others. Carmen's scrubs were faded but clean, her shoes practical but worn, her entire appearance speaking of someone who prioritized her child's needs above personal comfort or vanity. When Sophie successfully helped Ethan create a simple pictorial story about his day, the boy's face lit up with an expression of accomplishment Alexander hadn't seen since before Elena's death. For a moment, Ethan looked exactly as he had as a 5-year-old, eager and engaged with the world around him. "He's making remarkable progress," came a soft voice beside him. Carmen had approached while Alexander was absorbed in watching the children. "Sophie has a gift," Alexander replied carefully, studying Carmen's profile as she watched her daughter work. "She's had to develop patience and creativity," Carmen said, her voice carrying undertones of both pride and sadness. "When you face challenges yourself, you learn to see past surface difficulties to the person underneath." Alexander felt the weight of unspoken history in her words. Did she know he understood the deeper meaning? Was she speaking about Sophie's approach to Ethan, or about her own approach to the complicated situation of helping her nephew without revealing their family connection? "Carmen," Alexander began, then stopped, uncertain how to navigate this delicate territory. She turned to look at him directly, and for a moment her careful composure slipped. In her eyes, Alexander saw Elena's warmth, Elena's intelligence, and Elena's capacity for love that transcended circumstance and difficulty. "Yes?" Carmen prompted, her voice carefully neutral. Alexander realized he was at a crossroads. He could reveal his knowledge of their connection, potentially disrupting the careful balance Carmen had established to protect both their children. Or he could respect her apparent decision to maintain professional distance while allowing their family bonds to heal naturally through Sophie and Ethan's developing friendship. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything Sophie is doing for Ethan. This program means more to our family than you might realize." Carmen's eyes glistened slightly, and Alexander knew she understood the layered meaning in his words. She nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged both his gratitude and the complexity of emotions neither was ready to address directly. "Sophie loves helping other children," Carmen replied. "She says it makes her feel like her challenges have purpose." As pickup time approached and children began gathering their belongings, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave. For the first time in 3 years, he was in the presence of family, not just Ethan, but Elena's sister and her remarkable daughter. The connection felt both precious and fragile, like something that could be lost if handled carelessly. Ethan approached with Sophie, both children animated about plans for their next session. Sophie had created a special communication book for Ethan to take home, filled with pictures and symbols they could use to continue practicing between meetings. "This is for you," Sophie told Ethan, presenting the handmade book with ceremony. "So we can keep talking even when we're not together." Ethan accepted the gift with reverence, holding it against his chest like a treasure. Then, in a gesture that made both adults catch their breath, he reached out and briefly touched Sophie's hand, the first voluntary physical contact he'd initiated with another child since the accident. As families prepared to leave, Carmen helped. Sophie gathered her materials while maintaining the careful professional distance she'd established. But when she thought no one was watching, Alexander saw her studying Ethan with an expression of such profound tenderness that it took his breath away. She was seeing Elena in her nephew's features, recognizing family resemblances that time, and tragedy had separated. In Sophie's patient work with Ethan, Carmen was witnessing not just therapeutic progress, but the healing of family bonds that had been broken by misunderstanding and pride. The drive home was different this time. Ethan sat in the back seat, carefully examining Sophie's communication book and occasionally making soft sounds, not words, but vocalizations that suggested his voice might be returning gradually through patient encouragement rather than clinical intervention. Alexander's mind was occupied with plans and possibilities. He needed to understand more about Carmen's circumstances, her struggles as a single mother working multiple jobs while caring for a disabled daughter. More importantly, he needed to find ways to support his extended family without disrupting the careful balance Carmen had created to protect Sophie from potential disappointment. As the Bentley turned into the gates of the Sterling estate, Alexander made a decision that would prove to be the first of many changes to come. Tomorrow, he would begin quietly investigating ways to improve Carmen and Sophie's situation, not through direct charity that might be refused or misunderstood, but through opportunities that honored their dignity while providing the support they deserved as family. Elena's sister and daughter had been living 40 miles away in circumstances that would have broken his wife's heart. But now that fate had brought them together through Ethan's needs and Sophie's gifts, Alexander was determined to ensure that Elena's family would never struggle alone again. The weight of discovery sat heavily on his shoulders, but for the first time since Elena's death, it was accompanied by something that felt remarkably like hope. Friday morning brought unseasonably warm weather to Boston, but inside Sterling Pharmaceuticals' executive boardroom, the atmosphere remained as controlled as Alexander preferred. However, his usual laser focus on quarterly projections was compromised by thoughts of Carmen Martinez's second job, night shifts at a medical supply warehouse that kept her working until 3 a.m. to supplement her nursing assistant income. The background investigation Victoria had completed revealed more than family connections. It painted a picture of a woman stretched beyond reasonable limits, working 60-hour weeks while caring for a daughter whose medical needs required constant attention and significant expense. Carmen's financial records showed a careful balance. Between necessity and sacrifice, every dollar accounted for, with Sophie's therapy equipment and special education needs taking priority over basic comforts. "Alexander, you seem distracted," observed Board Chairman Robert Hayes, interrupting Alexander's contemplation. "Is everything all right with the pediatric trial protocols?" Alexander refocused on the presentation slides, showing promising results. For their latest neurological medication designed to help children with communication disorders. The irony wasn't lost on him. His company was developing treatments that might help children like Ethan, while his nephew received more effective assistance from a 12-year-old girl working with intuition and patience. "Actually, Robert, I've been considering expanding our community outreach programs," Alexander said, an idea crystallizing as he spoke. Specifically, partnerships with public schools that serve special needs populations. The boardroom fell silent. Alexander Sterling suggesting community involvement was like a calculator proposing to write poetry, theoretically possible, but practically unprecedented. "What type of partnerships?" asked Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Sterling Pharmaceuticals' head of public relations, clearly intrigued by the potential positive publicity. "Educational grants, equipment donations, perhaps funding for specialized programs that integrate pharmaceutical research with hands-on therapeutic approaches," Alexander replied, his mind working rapidly to construct a framework that would benefit Riverside Elementary, without appearing suspiciously targeted. By the meeting's end, Alexander had authorized a feasibility study for a $1 million community education initiative, focusing on schools with exceptional special needs programs. Riverside Elementary would undoubtedly qualify for significant support, providing resources that could transform their integration program while giving Carmen's work environment the recognition and funding it deserved. After lunch, Alexander made an unprecedented decision. He cancelled his afternoon meetings and drove to Riverside Elementary himself, arriving during the school's lunch period when the playground buzzed with normal childhood energy. He found Principal Foster in her office, reviewing budget documents that clearly showed the strain of operating an effective program with inadequate resources. Her face brightened with surprise when Alexander appeared in her doorway. "Mr. Sterling, is everything all right? Ethan's session isn't until next Tuesday." "I wanted to discuss the integration program in more detail," Alexander said, settling into the chair across from her cluttered desk. "My company is considering educational partnerships, and your program has impressed me significantly." Principal Foster's expression shifted from surprise to cautious optimism. In 30 years of public education, she'd learned to be skeptical of corporate promises, but Alexander Sterling's reputation for decisive action preceded him. "What kind of partnerships are you considering?" she asked carefully. Alexander outlined his morning's inspiration with growing conviction. Equipment grants for adaptive technology, funding for specialized training, resources to expand the program's reach, all legitimate educational investments that would dramatically improve the school's capabilities while directly benefiting Sophie's work environment. The program would need documentation of current methodologies and outcome measurements, Alexander explained, playing his corporate role while pursuing personal objectives. "I'd want comprehensive reports on your most effective therapeutic approaches." Principal Foster nodded enthusiastically, already envisioning possibilities that adequate funding could create. Sophie Martinez would be invaluable for those reports. Her instinctive methods with non-verbal children have produced results that trained therapists struggle to replicate. Perfect, Alexander thought. A legitimate reason to involve Carmen in program documentation, creating opportunities for professional advancement while maintaining the respectful distance she seemed determined to preserve. As they discussed implementation, timelines, Alexander's attention was drawn to voices outside the office window. In the playground, he could see Carmen had arrived early to help with the afternoon program setup. She moved efficiently despite her obvious fatigue, organizing materials while several children gathered around her with the comfortable familiarity that spoke of genuine affection. "Carmen Martinez is remarkable," Principal Foster observed, following his gaze. "Single mother, works multiple jobs, yet she volunteers her time to help with our program whenever her schedule permits. Sophie gets her dedication from watching her mother's example." Alexander watched Carmen laugh at something one of the children said, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the joy of interaction with young people who clearly adored her. The resemblance to Elena was strongest when she smiled, the same radiant warmth that had first attracted him to his wife 15 years ago. "How long has Sophie been involved in the program?" Alexander asked, gathering intelligence while maintaining casual conversation. 3 years since she was 9, initially as a participant when they first moved to the district, but we quickly realized she had extraordinary intuitive abilities with other special needs children. Principal Foster pulled out a file thick with documentation. Her progress. Reports are remarkable, not just her own development, but her impact on other children's advancement. Alexander reviewed the reports with growing amazement. Sophie's work with non-verbal children showed consistent success rates that exceeded professional therapeutic benchmarks. Her methods, while unconventional by clinical standards, produced Measurable improvements in communication, social interaction, and emotional expression. Has anyone studied her techniques formally? Alexander asked. We've documented everything carefully, but formal academic study requires resources we don't have, Principal Foster admitted. A partnership with your company could change that. Imagine if Sophie's intuitive methods could be studied, replicated, taught to other therapeutic programs across the country. The possibility excited Alexander beyond its business implications. Sophie's gift deserved recognition and development, but more importantly, such a study would provide Carmen with opportunities for advancement, consultant roles, speaking engagements, educational positions that could dramatically improve their financial stability while honoring her expertise. Their conversation was interrupted by commotion from the playground. Through the window, Alexander saw Sophie had fallen while helping another child, her cerebral palsy making recovery from even minor stumbles more challenging. Carmen rushed to her daughter's side, assessing injury while providing comfort with the practiced efficiency of both medical training and maternal concern. "Excuse me," Principal Foster said, hurrying toward the playground. Alexander followed, his protective instincts engaged despite the complicated family dynamics. By the time they reached Sophie, she was sitting up with Carmen's help, more embarrassed than injured but clearly shaken. "I'm okay," Sophie insisted, though tears gathered in her eyes. "I just lost my balance." Carmen's examination was thorough but gentle, checking for injury while maintaining Sophie's dignity in front of watching children. Her medical training was evident in the systematic way she assessed movement and response, but her maternal love showed in the soft reassurances she provided. "Maybe we should take you home early today," Carmen suggested quietly. "No," Sophie's response was immediate and emphatic. "Ethan comes on Tuesday. I'm making him a special communication board with pictures of his interests. I found out he likes space and rockets." Alexander's breath caught. How had Sophie learned about Ethan's fascination with astronomy? He hadn't mentioned it to anyone at the school, yet somehow this remarkable girl had intuited his son's interests with the same uncanny accuracy she applied to all her therapeutic work. "Sophie, how did you know Ethan likes space?" Principal Foster asked, echoing Alexander's curiosity. Sophie looked up at the adults with the matter-of-fact wisdom that consistently surprised everyone around her. "He was looking at my star stickers on Tuesday, and when I showed him the moon phases chart, his eyes got really excited. Plus, he drew a rocket ship when we were doing free art time." Carmen helped Sophie stand, testing her balance with careful attention. "If you're sure you feel okay, we can stay. But we take it easy with activities today." As they walked back toward the building, Alexander found himself beside Carmen while Sophie chatted with Principal Foster about her communication board plans. "Your medical training shows," Alexander observed quietly. "Sophie's fortunate to have a mother with professional healthcare background." Carmen glanced at him with that careful assessment he'd noticed before, searching for hidden meanings in casual conversation. "Nursing teaches you to notice details other people might miss," she replied diplomatically. "Elena always said healthcare workers see what others overlook," Alexander said softly, watching for her reaction to his wife's name. Carmen's step faltered almost imperceptibly, but she recovered quickly. "Elena sounds like she was very perceptive." The past tense hung between them, loaded with unspoken recognition. Carmen knew Elena was gone, just as Alexander knew Carmen was Elena's sister. Yet both maintained their careful dance around direct acknowledgement, protecting their children from complications neither fully understood how to navigate. Inside the building, Sophie had recovered her usual enthusiasm and was already organizing materials for her communication board project. Alexander watched her work with growing appreciation for the methodical intelligence behind her intuitive approaches. Every picture she selected served multiple communication purposes, Every arrangement offered children various pathways to express complex thoughts through simple gestures. "Mr. Sterling," Sophie called, looking up from her project, "do you think Ethan would like pictures of Saturn? I read that it has really pretty rings." Alexander moved closer, studying her careful selection of space-themed images. "I think he would love that. Saturn is his favorite planet." Sophie beamed with satisfaction. "I thought so. He seems like someone who appreciates beautiful things that are far away." The observation was so perceptive, it left Alexander momentarily speechless. Sophie had somehow understood that Ethan's fascination with space reflected his emotional distance from the world around him, that astronomy offered him beauty without the risk of human connection that had become too painful after losing his mother. As the afternoon progressed, Alexander found excuses to remain at the school, ostensibly discussing program details with Principal Foster, but actually observing the natural dynamic between Carmen and Sophie. Their relationship was remarkable, respectful but warm, disciplined but loving, marked by the easy communication that characterized families who'd faced challenges together and emerged stronger. When other children arrived for the afternoon program, Alexander positioned himself where he could observe without interfering. Carmen's interactions with various special needs children revealed the same intuitive understanding that made Sophie so effective. Mother and daughter shared more than physical resemblance. They possessed an inherited gift for seeing past surface difficulties to the potential underneath. "She's wonderful with them," Principal Foster commented, joining Alexander's observation. "Carmen volunteers whenever her work schedule allows. The children adore her, and she has remarkable insight into their individual needs." Alexander nodded, his mind working through possibilities. The corporate partnership he'd proposed could easily include provisions for parent coordinators, positions that would utilize Carmen's medical background while providing better compensation than her current multiple job situation. As pickup time approached, Alexander realized he'd spent the entire afternoon at an elementary school, behavior so unprecedented his executive staff would require medical intervention if they discovered it. Yet watching Sophie work with genuine joy, despite her physical challenges, seeing Carmen's quiet dignity in the face of obvious financial stress, observing the bond between this remarkable mother and daughter who were Elena's family, it felt more important than any boardroom decision he'd made in years. When Carmen began helping Sophie pack her materials, Alexander approached with an offer he'd been formulating throughout the afternoon. "Carmen, Principal Foster mentioned your medical background. When we implement the educational partnership I'm considering, we'll need someone with healthcare experience to help document therapeutic outcomes. Would you be interested in consulting work that could be scheduled around your current obligations?" Carmen studied him carefully, clearly weighing the implications of accepting anything that might create obligations or complications. "What type of consulting?" she asked finally. "Program documentation, outcome measurement, possibly helping design replicable methodologies based on Sophie's intuitive approaches," Alexander explained, keeping his tone professionally neutral. "It would be legitimate educational research that could benefit special needs programs nationally." For a moment, Carmen's composure cracked slightly, revealing exhaustion and hope warring in her expression. The opportunity he offered could transform their financial situation while honoring her expertise and Sophie's gifts. But accepting help from Elena's widower, even disguised as professional opportunity, clearly created emotional complications she wasn't ready to address directly. "I'd need to consider it carefully," Carmen said finally. "My current work schedule is demanding, and Sophie's needs have to come first." "Of course," Alexander replied. "There's no pressure or timeline. But Carmen," he lowered his voice slightly, "Sophie's work here is extraordinary. It deserves recognition and support, regardless of any other considerations." Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Alexander saw Eleanor's strength looking back at him, the same quiet determination to protect family while maintaining personal dignity that had made him fall in love with his wife so many years ago. As they prepared to leave, Sophie presented her completed communication board to Principal Foster with pride. The careful arrangement of space-themed images, symbols, and interactive elements represented hours of thoughtful preparation designed specifically for one small boy who needed to find his voice again. "This is for Ethan on Tuesday," Sophie announced. "I think it will help him tell us about the things he thinks about when he looks at the sky." Alexander felt emotion tighten his throat as he realized this 12-year-old girl, Elena's niece, his son's cousin, was providing his child with something all his wealth and resources couldn't purchase. Genuine understanding from someone who saw his potential rather than his limitations. The drive home was contemplative, filled with plans and possibilities that would have seemed impossible just days ago. Elena's family was within reach. Struggling but strong, gifted but undervalued. Through careful orchestration, Alexander could provide support while respecting Carmen's obvious desire to maintain independence. But more importantly, through Sophie's remarkable gift and Ethan's desperate need, two branches of Elena's family were finding their way back to each other, not through direct revelation of their connection, but through the patient work of healing that honored Elena's memory while creating new possibilities for the future. The pieces were moving into position, but Alexander understood that the most delicate part of this complex reunion was yet to come. Tuesday afternoon arrived with October's crisp promise of winter, but inside Riverside Elementary's multi-purpose room, warmth radiated from an unexpected source. Ethan Sterling sat cross-legged beside Sophie Martinez, both children absorbed in the space-themed communication board she had created specifically for him. For the first time since his mother's death, Ethan was attempting to vocalize sounds. Not words yet, but breathy whispers that accompanied his pointing to different astronomical images. Alexander stood in the observation area Principal Foster had discreetly arranged, watching through a one-way window as his son experienced something approaching normal childhood interaction. Beside him, Carmen Martinez maintained her professional distance, but her medical training was evident in how she observed and mentally catalogued every subtle indication of Ethan's progress. "Moon," Sophie said softly, pointing to a silvery image in the corner of her board. "Can you try to say moon, Ethan?" Ethan's lips moved silently at first, his brow furrowed with concentration. Then, barely audible but unmistakably intentional, came a whispered sound. "Moo!" The incomplete word hung in the air like a miracle. Carmen's sharp intake of breath echoed Alexander's own emotional response, both adults recognizing the significance of this moment. After 3 years of complete silence, Ethan was attempting speech. Sophie's reaction was perfect, celebratory but not overwhelming, encouraging without creating pressure. "That's amazing. The moon is so beautiful, just like your voice." She moved her finger to the next image, a detailed photograph of Saturn's rings. "What about this one, sir?" Ethan tried, his voice gaining slightly more strength. The sound was rough, uncertain, but undeniably progress. "Saturn!" Sophie exclaimed with genuine joy, "with all those gorgeous rings spinning around it. You picked my favorite planets, Ethan." Through the observation window, Alexander watched his son smile. Not the polite, careful expression he'd worn for 3 years, but a genuine, spontaneous reaction to successful communication. The transformation was so dramatic, it made Alexander's chest tight with emotions he'd thought permanently buried. "Remarkable," Carmen murmured beside him, her professional assessment evident in her tone. "Sophie's approach is creating neurological pathways that traditional therapy hasn't accessed. The combination of visual cues, patient encouragement, and peer interaction is clearly more effective than clinical intervention. Alexander turned to study Carmen's profile as she analyzed her daughter's work. You understand what's happening better than most professionals would. Nursing school included pediatric neurology courses? Carmen replied carefully. Plus, watching Sophie develop her own communication skills after her birth complications taught me to recognize breakthrough moments. The reference to Sophie's birth complications reminded Alexander of details from his investigation: premature delivery, extended NICU stay, Carmen facing medical decisions alone while her husband was deployed overseas. Elena's sister had navigated challenges that would have broken less determined people, yet here she stood, having raised a daughter whose gifts now offered hope to another family member she couldn't acknowledge. In the activity area, Sophie had moved beyond simple word attempts to something more complex. She'd arranged picture cards in sequence, creating visual stories that allowed Ethan to participate in narrative construction through pointing and increasingly confident vocalizations. Tell me about the astronaut's adventure, Sophie prompted, indicating a series of space-related images. Ethan studied the cards carefully, then began pointing with growing enthusiasm. Rock et, he managed, his voice stronger with each attempt. Up, up. The rocket goes up, Sophie confirmed, following his gestures. Where does it go? Ethan pointed to stars, then planets, his face animated with excitement as he constructed his story through the communication system Sophie had created specifically for his interests and abilities. Alexander found himself gripping the window frame, overwhelmed by witnessing his son's personality emerging from 3 years of silence. This was the child Elena had known, curious, imaginative, eager to share his thoughts and discoveries with others who cared enough to listen patiently. Dr. Kellerman should see this, Alexander said suddenly, referring to Sterling Pharmaceuticals' pediatric research director. Sophie's methodology could revolutionize approaches to selective mutism. Carmen's posture stiffened slightly. Sophie isn't a research subject, Mr. Sterling. She's a child who happens to have exceptional empathy. The protective edge in her voice reminded Alexander that he was walking a delicate line. Carmen's willingness to allow Sophie's participation in helping Ethan was based on her daughter's natural desire to help other children, not on any interest in clinical study or professional recognition. I didn't mean to suggest exploitation, Alexander replied carefully, but Sophie's gifts deserve broader recognition. Children across the country could benefit from understanding her intuitive approaches. Before Carmen could respond, commotion from the activity area drew their attention. Sophie had fallen again, her balance compromised by fatigue from maintaining difficult positions during her work with Ethan. This time, however, instead of adults rushing to help, Ethan was the first to react. Sophie! The word burst from Ethan's lips with startling clarity, his first complete emotionally driven statement in 3 years. Both children were on the floor now, but instead of focusing on her own discomfort, Sophie was staring at Ethan with wonder. You said my name. You really said my name? Ethan nodded vigorously, then did something that made both watching adults catch their breath. He reached out and gently helped Sophie sit up, his concern for her overriding his usual social withdrawal. Are you hurt? Ethan asked, his voice still quiet but increasingly confident. I'm okay, Sophie assured him, beaming with pride at his verbal breakthrough. But Ethan, you're talking, really talking. Other children in the program had noticed the interaction, and several gathered around with curiosity and support. Instead of withdrawing as he typically did when becoming the center of attention, Ethan remained focused on Sophie's well-being. Your leg brace, Ethan observed, pointing to where Sophie's mobility aid had shifted during her fall. Does it hurt? Sophie adjusted the brace with practiced efficiency, but her attention remained on Ethan's remarkable progress. Sometimes it's uncomfortable, But it helps me walk better, kind of like how the communication board helps you talk better. The analogy was perfect in its simplicity. Both children used tools to overcome challenges. Both understood adaptation without feeling diminished by their needs for assistance. Alexander and Carmen emerged from the observation area as principal. Foster approached the children with medical supplies and gentle concern. But the crisis had passed, transformed instead into a celebration of breakthrough and mutual support. "Ethan," Principal Foster said warmly, "I heard you speaking. How wonderful." Ethan looked around at the gathered adults, suddenly self-conscious about the attention his progress had attracted. But when his gaze found Alexander, instead of the anxiety that typically accompanied direct focus, his expression showed pride, mixed with hope. "Dad," Ethan said clearly, the word carrying 3 years of suppressed communication. "Sophie helped me find my voice." Alexander knelt beside his son, emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "Yes, she did. Sophie is very special. Can we help her too?" Ethan asked, his newfound verbal ability revealing the empathy that had always existed beneath his silence. "Her mom works really hard, and sometimes Sophie gets tired from her leg." The innocent observation hit both adults with stunning force. Ethan, in his first extended conversation in years, was expressing concern for Sophie's well-being and recognition of Carmen's struggles. His emotional intelligence, suppressed but not destroyed by trauma, was emerging alongside his voice. Carmen's eyes filled with tears, whether from pride in her daughter's achievement, amazement at Ethan's breakthrough, or recognition that this 8-year-old boy was Elena's son, showing Elena's characteristic compassion for others' struggles. "That's very thoughtful, Ethan," Carmen managed, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Sophie loves helping other children. Knowing she helped you makes her very happy." As the immediate excitement settled and other children returned to their activities, Sophie and Ethan continued their work together with new confidence. Sophie's communication board had served its purpose, but now Ethan was attempting direct verbal interaction, using words to express thoughts and feelings. He'd kept locked away since his mother's death. "Sophie," Ethan said carefully, "why do you like helping kids who don't talk?" Sophie considered the question with the seriousness she applied to all important matters. "Because everyone has important things to say, even if they can't say them with words. And sometimes when people help you find your voice, you want to help other people find theirs too." Alexander and Carmen exchanged glances over their children's heads, both recognizing profound wisdom in Sophie's simple explanation. They were witnessing more than therapeutic breakthrough. They were seeing the beginning of genuine friendship between two children who understood challenge and adaptation in ways their peers couldn't comprehend. As the session concluded, Alexander found himself reluctant to leave. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan was eagerly anticipating future social interaction, asking when he could see Sophie again and what communication activities they might try next week. "Thursday," Sophie promised, already planning their next session. "I'm going to bring pictures of different jobs people do, and we can practice talking about what you might want to be when you grow up." "An astronaut," Ethan replied without hesitation, his voice growing stronger with each successful communication. "Perfect," Sophie exclaimed. "I'll find pictures of space stations and rocket ships and all the tools astronauts use as families." Prepared to leave, Alexander approached Carmen with an offer he'd been formulating throughout the afternoon's remarkable progress. "Carmen, I meant what I said about consulting opportunities. After witnessing Sophie's work today, I'm convinced Sterling Pharmaceutical should fund comprehensive research into her methodologies, not as experimental subjects," he added quickly, seeing her protective instincts engage, "but as collaborative partners in developing new therapeutic approaches." Carmen studied him carefully, clearly weighing professional opportunity against Personal complications. What would that involve? Documentation of Sophie's techniques, outcome measurement, possibly training other therapeutic professionals in her intuitive approaches. The position would be part-time, well compensated, and designed around your current schedule and Sophie's needs. The offer was generous enough to transform their financial situation while respecting their autonomy and dignity. Alexander could see Carmen's internal struggle. Accepting help from Elena's widower felt complicated, but refusing opportunities that could benefit both Sophie's recognition and their family's stability seemed equally problematic. "I need time to consider it," Carmen said finally, "and I'd want to discuss any research involvement with Sophie. Her participation would have to be completely voluntary." "Of course," Alexander agreed. "There's no pressure or timeline, but Carmen, watching Sophie work today, seeing how she reached Ethan when professional therapists couldn't, her gift deserves recognition and support." As they walked toward the parking area, Ethan surprised everyone by initiating conversation with Carmen directly. "Mrs. Martinez," he said politely, "thank you for letting Sophie help me. She's the best friend I've ever had." Carmen knelt to Ethan's eye level, her expression soft with emotion. "Sophie loves having you as a friend too, Ethan. You're both very special children." The interaction was brief but significant. The first time Ethan had engaged directly with an adult outside his immediate family since the accident. Carmen's gentle response and genuine warmth created another small bridge across the complicated family connections neither adult was ready to address directly. As Alexander and Ethan drove home, the boy chatted excitedly about his afternoon, the first extended conversation they'd shared since Elena's death. Ethan's voice was still quiet, still tentative, but unmistakably present and growing stronger with each successful exchange. "Dad," Ethan said, as they turned into their estate's gates, "can we do something nice for Sophie and her mom? They help people, but they don't have as much money as we do." The observation was delivered with characteristic childhood directness, but it revealed emotional intelligence and social awareness that had been hidden beneath 3 years of silence. Ethan had not only found his voice, he was discovering his capacity for empathy and his desire to use his family's resources to help others. "What did you have in mind?" Alexander asked, curious about his son's developing perspective on their wealth and its potential purposes. "Maybe we could get Sophie a better leg brace, or help her mom not have to work so many jobs. Sophie told me her mom is always tired because she works at night too." Alexander's chest tightened with pride and love for this remarkable child who was Elena's son in every way that mattered. Despite trauma and isolation, Ethan possessed his mother's generous heart and intuitive understanding of others' needs. "Those are wonderful ideas," Alexander replied carefully. "We'll find ways to help that respect their dignity and independence." As they pulled into the circular drive of the Sterling mansion, Alexander realized that everything had changed. Ethan was speaking, engaging, showing interest in the world beyond his own pain. But more importantly, he was demonstrating the capacity for love and concern that would honor Elena's memory, while building bridges to the family she'd lost so many years ago. The breakthrough they'd witnessed wasn't just therapeutic, it was the beginning of healing that would transform all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The following week brought unexpected developments that would test the careful boundaries everyone had established. Carmen Martinez sat in the employee break room at Boston General Hospital during her lunch break, staring at the formal consultation contract Alexander Sterling had delivered through Principal Foster. The terms were more generous than anything she'd imagined, enough to eliminate her need for night shift warehouse work while providing comprehensive benefits that would cover Sophie's ongoing medical needs. But accepting meant deeper involvement with Elena's widower, a man who clearly knew more about their family connection than he was revealing. Carmen's supervisor, Nancy Chen, noticed her distraction as she approached with coffee and the world-weary expression of someone who'd spent 20 years in hospital administration. "You look like someone wrestling with a life-changing decision," Nancy observed, settling beside Carmen at the small table. "Care to share with someone who's made plenty of questionable choices?" Carmen hesitated, then showed Nancy the contract documents. A consulting opportunity, documenting therapeutic methodologies for a pharmaceutical company's educational initiative. Nancy whistled softly as she reviewed the compensation figures. "Carmen, this would triple your current income. What's the catch?" The question Carmen had been asking herself repeatedly. "It involves my daughter's work with special needs children. I'm concerned about exploitation or unrealistic expectations." "Sterling Pharmaceutical," Nancy read from the letterhead. "Alexander Sterling's company. That's interesting timing." "Why?" Nancy leaned forward conspiratorially. "Sterling donated $50,000 to our pediatric wing last week. Completely unexpected, no publicity, no naming rights requested. Just a check with instructions to improve patient communication therapy resources." Carmen's breath caught. Alexander's generosity was expanding beyond Riverside Elementary, reaching into her professional environment as well. The pattern suggested deliberate orchestration, but with purposes she couldn't fully understand. "Did he specify what the donation should fund?" Carmen asked carefully. "Equipment for nonverbal children, communication devices, family counseling services." Very specific requirements that our director said seemed unusually well-informed for someone without direct experience in pediatric therapy. But Alexander did have direct experience with Ethan's selective mutism and now with witnessing Sophie's breakthrough methods. Carmen realized she was seeing evidence of a man using his resources to create systematic improvements in areas that affected his son's condition and his extended family's circumstances. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Ethan's coming to school today. He asked his dad if he could visit during regular hours, not just program time. Is that okay?" Carmen stared at the message, understanding its significance. Ethan Sterling, who had attended private school exclusively since kindergarten, was requesting to spend time in a public school environment because of his connection with Sophie. The social breakthrough was expanding beyond therapeutic sessions into genuine friendship. She typed back, "Of course, sweetheart. Make sure he feels welcome." "What's that smile about?" Nancy asked, noticing Carmen's expression softening. "My daughter has been helping a boy learn to speak again. Apparently, he wants to visit her school today." Nancy studied Carmen's face with the perception that came from years of reading people in crisis situations. "This consulting contract, it's connected to your daughter's work with this boy, isn't it?" Carmen nodded slowly. "In ways that are more complicated than they appear." At Riverside Elementary, Alexander Sterling was experiencing his own complications. As he accompanied Ethan for his first voluntary visit to a public school during regular hours. The contrast with Beacon Hill Academy was even more striking during normal school operations. Children from diverse backgrounds interacting naturally, teachers managing larger classes with creativity and patience, and energy and authenticity that his son's expensive private education couldn't replicate. "There's Sophie!" Ethan exclaimed, pointing toward the playground, where his friend was helping younger children navigate playground equipment adapted for various mobility needs. Alexander watched Sophie demonstrate the same intuitive leadership with 5- and 6-year-olds that she showed with non-verbal children. She naturally included everyone, modified activities to accommodate different abilities, and created an environment where differences became advantages rather than obstacles. "She's remarkable," Principal Foster said, joining Alexander's observation. Sophie has that rare gift of making everyone feel capable and valued. The younger children compete for her attention, but she never shows favoritism. As they approached the playground, Alexander noticed something that made him pause. Sophie was wearing a new ankle brace, clearly expensive, custom-fitted equipment that would have cost several $1,000s. Carmen's insurance wouldn't cover such specialized devices, and her salary certainly couldn't accommodate the expense. Sophie's mobility seems improved, Alexander commented carefully. Principal Foster nodded enthusiastically. Remarkable improvement since she got the new orthotic device. Her mother mentioned an anonymous benefactor provided funding through the hospital's patient assistance program. Sophie's walking with much less fatigue now. Alexander felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern. Someone else was also providing support for his extended family, either another wealthy benefactor who'd learned of Sophie's situation, or Carmen had found additional resources he wasn't aware of. The possibility that someone else might be involved in Sophie's care triggered unexpected protective instincts. "Mr. Sterling," Sophie called, noticing their approach. She moved toward them with visibly improved mobility, her new brace allowing for more natural movement patterns. "Hello, Sophie," Alexander replied, studying her carefully. "You seem to be moving more easily today." Sophie beamed with pride. "My new brace is amazing. Mom says someone donated money specifically for kids like me to get better equipment. Isn't that wonderful?" The innocent joy in her voice made Alexander's chest tight with emotion. Sophie's gratitude for anonymous generosity reminded him of Elena's similar appreciation for unexpected kindness, a family trait that valued help while maintaining dignity. Ethan had remained close to his father during this interaction, but now he stepped forward with growing confidence. "Sophie, can you show me around your school? I want to see where you have classes." "Of course," Sophie replied, already planning their route. "We have art class next, and Mrs. Patterson lets visitors participate if they want to." As the children headed toward the building, Alexander found himself walking beside Principal Foster, both adults charmed by the natural friendship developing between two remarkable children. "Ethan's transformation since joining our program has been extraordinary," Principal Foster observed. "But today feels different, more like a social visit than therapeutic necessity." Alexander nodded, understanding the distinction. He specifically asked to spend time here as Sophie's friend, not as a program participant. That's significant progress. Most children with selective mutism struggle with initiating social contact. Ethan's actively seeking interaction. Inside the art classroom, Alexander positioned himself where he could observe without interfering as Sophie introduced Ethan to her regular classmates. The children's reactions revealed Sophie's social status, clearly respected and well-liked, someone whose opinion carried weight in classroom dynamics. "This is my friend Ethan," Sophie announced to the small group gathered around the paint supplies. "He goes to a different school, but he's visiting today." The casual introduction helped Ethan integrate naturally into the activity. Soon, he was collaborating on a landscape painting with two other children, his voice growing stronger as he shared ideas and responded to their questions about his artistic choices. Mrs. Patterson, the art teacher, approached Alexander with curiosity. "Ethan has exceptional artistic ability. His understanding of color and composition is quite advanced for his age." Alexander watched his son explain perspective techniques to another child, demonstrating the intelligence and creativity that had been hidden beneath 3 years of silence. Elena would have been proud of their son's artistic development and his emerging social confidence. Art was his mother's passion, Alexander explained quietly. "She was a graphic designer before we married." "The talent clearly inherited," Mrs. Patterson observed. "Sophie mentioned his mother isn't living." "She died 3 years ago in a car accident. Ethan witnessed it and stopped speaking afterward. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened with understanding. "And Sophie helped him find his voice again?" "Sophie sees possibilities where others see only problems," Alexander replied, echoing Carmen's earlier description of her daughter's perspective. As the art session continued, Alexander noticed Sophie's subtle but consistent support of Ethan's integration into group activities. She included him without making his participation feel like charity, challenged him without creating pressure, and celebrated his contributions without drawing uncomfortable attention to his progress. When lunch period arrived, Alexander expected Ethan to want to leave. Large group situations typically overwhelmed him. Instead, he asked if they could eat in the cafeteria with Sophie and her friends. The cafeteria experience proved revelatory. Ethan navigated the lunch line with growing confidence, made conversation with children he'd just met, and demonstrated social skills that had been suppressed but not destroyed by his trauma. Most remarkably, he showed genuine interest in other children's lives and experiences, asking questions and listening to responses with the empathy that characterized Elena's interactions with people. "Ethan," one boy asked during lunch, "why don't you go to school here all the time?" Ethan glanced at his father, clearly considering possibilities that hadn't existed before today. "I go to Beacon Hill Academy. It's different from here." "Different how?" Sophie asked with characteristic directness. Ethan thought carefully before answering. "Quieter, more rules, not as much laughing." The simple comparison revealed how much Ethan preferred Riverside Elementary's environment. The authenticity, diversity, and energy that made learning feel natural rather than obligatory. After lunch, Alexander received an unexpected call from Carmen. Her voice carried stress that immediately put him on alert. "Mr. Sterling, I'm at Boston General. There's been an incident involving one of my patients and I need to work late tonight. Sophie's supposed to attend the after-school program until I can pick her up, but..." "But?" Alexander prompted, already anticipating the request. "She's been looking forward to showing Ethan more of the school, and I hate to cut their visit short because of my work emergency." Alexander found himself offering before fully considering implications. "Ethan and Sophie could come to our house this afternoon. I'll bring Sophie back to you whenever you're finished with work." The suggestion created several complications, bringing Carmen's daughter into his home environment, extending their family interaction beyond school boundaries, and providing Carmen with direct evidence of his wealth and lifestyle. But the alternative was disappointing both children and potentially compromising Carmen's professional responsibilities. "I couldn't impose like that," Carmen protested, though relief was evident in her voice. "It's not an imposition. Ethan would be thrilled to show Sophie our house, and Mrs. Henderson loves having children around." After brief hesitation, Carmen agreed, providing detailed instructions about Sophie's afternoon medication schedule and mobility needs. Her careful attention to medical details reminded Alexander of her professional competence and maternal dedication. 2. Drive to the Sterling estate provided an opportunity for both children to process their day's experiences. Sophie was characteristically direct in her curiosity about wealth and privilege, while Ethan seemed eager to share his world with someone who understood challenge and adaptation. "Is your house really big?" Sophie asked as they turned through the estate's gates. "Pretty big," Ethan replied with understatement that would have amused his father under different circumstances. Sophie's reaction to the Sterling mansion was everything Alexander had anticipated: wonder at the scale and beauty, but without the intimidation that often characterized children's responses to extreme wealth. She approached the experience with curiosity rather than anxiety, asking questions about architecture and landscaping with genuine interest. Mrs. Henderson's reaction to Sophie was immediately positive. The elderly housekeeper, who had grieved, Ethan's isolation, almost as deeply as Alexander, welcomed his friend with warmth that suggested she understood Sophie's significance in the boy's recovery. "Miss Sophie," Mrs. Henderson said formally, "Master Ethan has told me wonderful things about your friendship. Welcome to Sterling House." Sophie's polite response and evident appreciation for Mrs. Henderson's courtesy immediately established positive rapport. Soon the children were exploring the mansion's various rooms, with Ethan proudly showing off favorite spaces, while Sophie asked thoughtful questions about family history and household operations. In Elena's former art studio, which Alexander had preserved but rarely visited, Sophie's artistic eye immediately recognized the quality and emotional depth of the paintings that lined the walls. "Your mom was really talented," Sophie said softly, studying a landscape that captured New England autumn with remarkable skill. "She painted every day," Ethan replied, his voice carrying love rather than the pain that had previously accompanied. References to his mother. "Do you paint too?" "Sometimes. Not as good as her, but Dad says I'm getting better." Sophie moved carefully around the studio, examining easels and art supplies with respectful appreciation. "Maybe we could paint together sometime? I'm not very good, but I love trying." "We could paint space pictures," Ethan suggested enthusiastically. "Mom would have liked that." Alexander listened from the doorway, amazed by his son's ability to discuss Elena positively in Sophie's presence. The girl's natural acceptance of death as part of life experience seemed to give Ethan permission to remember his mother with joy rather than only grief. As afternoon turned to evening, Alexander found himself genuinely enjoying the children's company. Sophie's presence brought energy and laughter to rooms that had been silent for years, while Ethan's personality continued emerging through interaction with someone who saw his potential rather than his limitations. When Carmen arrived to collect, Sophie, her reaction to the Sterling estate was carefully controlled, but clearly overwhelming. Alexander watched her take in the obvious wealth while maintaining dignity and composure that reminded him powerfully of Elena's grace under pressure. "Thank you for having Sophie," Carmen said formally, though her eyes showed genuine gratitude, mixed with complicated emotions about accepting such significant help. "It was our pleasure," Alexander replied honestly. "Sophie and Ethan have become genuine friends." As Sophie gathered her things and said goodbye to Mrs. Henderson, Alexander made a decision that would prove pivotal to their developing relationships. "Carmen, would you and Sophie like to stay for dinner? Mrs. Henderson prepared more than enough, and the children seem reluctant to end their visit." The invitation crossed another boundary in their carefully maintained distance, but watching. Sophie and Ethan's friendship develop had convinced Alexander that artificial separation was causing more harm than honest connection. Elena's family deserved to be welcomed into Elena's home, regardless of complicated history or unresolved tensions. Carmen's acceptance of the dinner invitation would mark the beginning of the most significant evening in all their lives since Elena's death, a night when carefully guarded secrets would finally surface, transforming their understanding of each other and themselves in ways that would honor the past while creating possibilities for an unexpected future. The Sterling dining room had never hosted a more emotionally charged dinner. Crystal chandelier light cast warm shadows across the mahogany table where Alexander, Carmen, Sophie, and Ethan shared a meal that felt simultaneously natural and momentous. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself with comfort food that put everyone at ease: roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables arranged with elegance but without intimidation. Sophie's animated description of her school day filled the spaces between more careful adult conversation, while Ethan contributed observations and questions with growing confidence. The children's easy interaction created a buffer that allowed the adults to navigate their complicated dynamic without direct confrontation of unresolved issues. "Mrs. Henderson," Sophie said politely during a pause in conversation, "this is the most delicious dinner I've ever had. You must have cooked for lots of fancy people." Mrs. Henderson beamed with pride as she refilled water glasses. "Miss Sophie, you're too kind. But I'll tell you a secret. The best meals are made for people you care about, not for fancy occasions." Carmen watched this exchange with the careful attention she applied to all interactions involving her daughter. Alexander could see her cataloguing and details, Mrs. Henderson's genuine warmth towards Sophie, the casual elegance of their surroundings, the way Ethan naturally included Sophie in family dynamics. "Mom," Sophie said suddenly, "Mr. Sterling's house has a library with more books than our whole apartment building, and Ethan's mom painted all these beautiful pictures before she died." The innocent reference to Eleanor created a moment of charged silence. Carmen's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, while Alexander felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any mention of his wife. "Ethan showed me her art studio," Sophie continued, oblivious to adult tension. "She painted landscapes and flowers and people. She was really talented." "What was your favorite painting?" Carmen asked quietly, her voice carefully controlled. Ethan considered the question seriously. "The one of the ocean in Texas. Mom said she painted it from memory of a place she visited when she was young." Carmen's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp in the sudden silence. Alexander saw recognition flash across her face. Elena had painted their childhood beach in Galveston, the place where the Vasquez sisters had spent summer vacations before family conflicts tore them apart. "Ah, you okay, Mom?" Sophie asked, concerned by her mother's obvious distress. Carmen recovered quickly, the practiced composure of someone accustomed to hiding difficult emotions from her child. "Fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about how talented Mrs. Sterling must have been." But Alexander caught the tremor in her voice, the way her hands shook slightly as she reached for her water glass. Carmen was struggling with the reality of sitting in Elena's home, hearing casual references to her sister's artwork, witnessing her daughter bond with Elena's son. After dinner, as the children explored the mansion's game room, Alexander found Carmen standing before Elena's Galveston beach painting in the main hallway. She stood perfectly still, studying details with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message from the past. "She always loved that beach," Carmen said softly, not turning when Alexander approached. "We spent every summer there until our parents decided I was too independent and Elena was too influenced by American culture." The admission hung between them, the first direct acknowledgement of their shared connection to Elena. Alexander studied Carmen's profile, seeing Elena's features reflected in her sister's face as she gazed at their childhood landscape. "Elena painted this the year before Ethan was born," Alexander said carefully. "She said it reminded her of innocence and possibility." Carmen's eyes filled with tears she was clearly fighting to control. She always saw beauty in places others overlooked. Even as children, Elena could find magic in ordinary moments. "She never stopped missing her family," Alexander continued, taking a calculated risk. "Especially her younger sister. She regretted the choices that separated them." Carmen turned to face him directly, her composure finally cracking. "You know, it wasn't a question." Carmen had realized that Alexander understood exactly who she was, had known for some time, and had been carefully orchestrating their reconnection without forcing direct confrontation. "I've known since the first day I heard your name," Alexander confirmed gently. Elena Vasquez became Carmen Martinez, but you're still Elena's sister." Carmen's tears began flowing freely now, years of suppressed grief and guilt finally finding release. "She died thinking I had chosen sides against her. I never got to explain that I moved to Boston to be closer to her family, that I wanted Sophie to know her aunt and cousin. Alexander felt his own emotional walls crumbling as he witnessed Carmen's pain, grief that mirrored his own, but carried the additional burden of unresolved reconciliation. Elena's sister had been living 40 miles away, struggling to support Sophie alone, while Alexander grieved in isolation, surrounded by wealth that couldn't purchase the family connections they both needed. "Elena never knew you were here?" Alexander asked, though he already understood the tragic timing. "I came to Boston in 2010, 6 months after Sophie was born. Miguel was deployed, and I wanted Sophie to grow up knowing Elena's family. But by the time I gathered courage to contact her," Carmen's voice broke, "the accident had already happened. The cruel timing hit Alexander with devastating force. Carmen had been reaching out to rebuild their family relationship at the exact moment Elena was killed, creating a tragedy of missed connections that had shaped 3 years of unnecessary isolation for all of them. Elena would have been overjoyed," Alexander said with absolute certainty. "She talked about you constantly, wondering where you were, whether you were happy, if you'd forgiven her for choosing our parents' approval over your relationship." Carmen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to compose herself. "I never needed forgiveness. I understood the impossible position our parents put her in. I just wanted her to know that family doesn't end because of geography or disapproval." From the game room came the sound of children's laughter, Sophie and Ethan discovering shared interests in electronic games and friendly competition. Their joy provided sharp contrast to the adults' grief-laden conversation. "They're cousins," Carmen said wonderfully, as if speaking the truth aloud gave it more reality. "They're family," Alexander confirmed, "and they've found each other despite everything that tried to keep them apart." Carmen studied Alexander's face with new understanding. "You've been helping us deliberately. The hospital donations, the job opportunity, Sophie's medical equipment. You've been taking care of Elena's family." "I've been trying to do what Elena would have wanted," Alexander replied honestly. "But more than that, I've been learning what I need. Watching Sophie help Ethan heal has shown me that isolation doesn't honor Elena's memory. Connection does." Their conversation was interrupted by Sophie's voice calling from the game room. "Mom, come see what Ethan taught me." Carmen hesitated, clearly overwhelmed by the emotional revelations of the evening, but Alexander gently touched her arm, offering support and encouragement. "Elena's children are getting to know each other," he said softly. "Maybe it's time Elena's family did the same." In the game room, they found Sophie and Ethan engaged in animated conversation about space exploration, while sharing a tablet that displayed images from NASA's latest missions. The children's natural compatibility was evident in their comfortable body language and easy communication. "Mom, did you know that Ethan wants to be an astronaut?" Sophie asked excitedly. "And I told him I want to be a doctor who helps kids with disabilities. And he said we could work together someday, him exploring space for new medicines while I help kids on Earth." The innocent career planning touched both adults deeply. These children, who had found each other through therapeutic necessity, were already envisioning shared futures that honored both their individual strengths and their family connection. "That sounds like an excellent partnership," Carmen managed, her voice still rough with emotion. Ethan looked up at his father with growing confidence. "Dad, can Sophie come visit again soon? I want to show her Mom's telescope, and Mrs. Henderson said she'd teach us to make her special cookies." Alexander glanced at Carmen, seeking permission while offering invitation. "Sophie and her mother are always welcome here, Ethan. This is a big house that's been too quiet for too long." As the evening wound down and Carmen prepared to take Sophie home, Alexander walked them to the door with a sense that everything fundamental had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained was no longer necessary. Truth had been acknowledged. Family connections recognized and possibilities for healing had been established. "Carmen," Alexander said, as she helped Sophie with her jacket, "Elena would want us to be family, not just for the children's sake, but because that's who we are." Carmen nodded, still processing the emotional weight of the evening's revelations. "It's complicated, Alexander. I'm not Elena, and you're not Miguel. We're different people with different histories." "But we're both parents who love these children," Alexander replied. "And we're both people Elena loved who need to stop grieving." Alone. As Carmen and Sophie drove away, Alexander stood in his doorway, watching their modest car disappear into the night. For the first time since Elena's death, the mansion felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home awaiting the return of family. Ethan appeared beside him, still energized by the evening's social success. "Dad, is Sophie really my cousin?" Alexander looked down at his son, realizing that Elena's family connections were no longer secrets to be carefully managed, but relationships to be celebrated and nurtured. "Yes, Ethan, Sophie is your cousin and Carmen is your Aunt Carmen. They're the family your mother talked about and missed every day." Ethan processed this information with the acceptance children brought to complex adult situations. "So, we're not alone anymore." The question captured the essence of their transformation perfectly. "No, son, we're not alone anymore." Later that night, Alexander stood in Elena's art studio surrounded by paintings that took on new meaning now that Elena's sister had seen them. The Galveston beach painting seemed to glow with possibility, not just memory of past innocence, but promise of family connections that had survived separation, misunderstanding, and tragedy. His phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "Thank you for tonight, for everything. Elena would be proud of the man you've become and the father you are to Ethan." Alexander typed back, "Elena would be proud of the mother you are to Sophie and the strength you've shown through impossible circumstances. Welcome home, Carmen." The response came quickly. "Home. I like the sound of that." As Alexander prepared for bed, he realized that Elena's greatest wish, for her family to be reunited and her son to find his voice, had been fulfilled through the mysterious connections that bind people across time and circumstance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they learned to navigate their reconstructed family dynamics. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Alexander Sterling fell asleep without the crushing weight of grief and isolation. Elena's family was healing. Her sister was safe. Her son was speaking, and her legacy lived on through the love that connected them all. The revelation that had seemed so complicated in anticipation had proven surprisingly simple in reality. They were family. They needed each other, and love had found a way to bring them home. 6 months later, the Sterling mansion had transformed from a monument to grief into a vibrant family home. The sound of children's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for years, while the aroma of Carmen's weekend cooking filled spaces where only Mrs. Henderson's formal meals had once been served. On this particular Saturday morning in April, Alexander found himself in Elena's former art studio, now converted into a shared creative space where Sophie and Ethan collaborated on projects that combined art, science, and pure imagination. "Dad, look what Sophie helped me design," Ethan called excitedly, holding up architectural plans for an accessible playground that incorporated both mobility aids and space-themed equipment. At 9 years old, his artistic talent had blossomed under Sophie's encouraging influence, while his social confidence had grown beyond anything Alexander had thought possible. Sophie, now 13 and moving with dramatically improved mobility, thanks to cutting-edge equipment funded through Sterling Pharmaceuticals' newly established Pediatric Assistance Program, had become a recognized advocate for inclusive design in recreational spaces. Her insights about accessibility had evolved from personal experience into professional expertise that impressed veteran architects and engineers. The rocket ship climbing structure has ramps integrated into the design, Sophie explained, with the precision of someone who understood both engineering principles and practical needs. So kids with different mobility levels can explore together. Instead of being separated into special and regular equipment, Alexander studied their collaborative design with genuine admiration. The playground concept reflected both children's growth, Ethan's artistic vision, combined with Sophie's understanding of inclusive functionality, creating something beautiful that served everyone effectively. "This is remarkable work," Alexander said honestly. "Have you considered submitting it to the city's recreational planning committee?" The children exchanged excited glances, their partnership having developed into genuine friendship that transcended their therapeutic origins. Over the past months, they had become inseparable companions whose different strengths complemented each other perfectly. "Could we really do that?" Ethan asked, his voice strong and clear, a dramatic change from the whispered attempts at communication that had marked his early progress with Sophie. Sterling Pharmaceuticals' Community Initiative Program specifically funds projects that improve accessibility in public spaces, Alexander replied, watching their excitement build. "Your design could benefit thousands of children across the region." From the kitchen came Carmen's voice calling them for lunch, another transformation that had evolved naturally over the months. Carmen had accepted the consulting position with Sterling Pharmaceutical, bringing her medical expertise to their pediatric research programs while maintaining her commitment to direct patient care. More significantly, she had gradually accepted Alexander's invitations to share family meals, help with household decisions, and participate in Ethan's parenting in ways that honored Elena's memory while creating new family dynamics. As they gathered in the kitchen, Alexander reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed since that first encounter in Riverside Elementary's parking lot. Carmen had moved into the mansion's guest wing 3 months earlier, not as Alexander's romantic partner, but as Ethan's aunt and Sophie's mother, creating a family structure that provided stability for both children while allowing the adults to navigate their complicated relationship without pressure or artificial timelines. "The playground design is ready for professional review," Alexander announced as they settled around the kitchen table that had become their informal family gathering. "Space." Carmen looked up from serving homemade soup, her expression brightening with pride. "Really? They've been working on it for weeks. It incorporates principles from Sophie's therapeutic methodologies," Alexander explained. "Inclusive design that doesn't segregate children by ability level, but creates opportunities for collaborative play regardless of individual challenges." The conversation was interrupted by Alexander's phone ringing with a call from Dr. Patricia Marsh, the therapist who had first suggested Ethan's participation in Riverside Elementary's program. Alexander had maintained contact with her throughout Ethan's remarkable recovery, providing updates that had influenced her recommendations for other families facing similar challenges. "Dr. Marsh," Alexander answered, putting the call on speaker, so everyone could participate. "Alexander, I hope I'm not interrupting family time, but I have exciting news. The American Association of Pediatric Therapists wants to feature Sophie's methodologies in their annual conference. They're offering her a speaking opportunity and requesting documentation of her techniques for their professional journal." Sophie's eyes widened with surprise and excitement, while Carmen's expression showed maternal pride mixed with protective concern about her daughter being thrust into professional spotlight at such a young age. "What would that involve?" Carmen asked carefully. A presentation about peer-to-peer therapeutic approaches, demonstration of communication techniques, and collaboration with professional therapists to develop training materials that could be used nationwide, Dr. Marsh explained. Sophie would be the youngest presenter in the conference's history, but her results speak for themselves. Alexander watched Sophie process this information with the thoughtful consideration she applied to all important decisions. At 13, she had already demonstrated remarkable maturity and insight, but the prospect of national professional recognition carried implications that needed careful evaluation. Could Ethan be part of the presentation? Sophie asked after a moment of contemplation. Our work together shows how the techniques actually function, and he understands the process from the participant's perspective. The suggestion revealed Sophie's characteristic wisdom, recognizing that her success was inseparable from her partnership with Ethan, and that authentic demonstration would be more effective than theoretical explanation. That's an excellent idea, Dr. Marsh agreed enthusiastically. A collaborative presentation would provide both therapeutic and participant perspectives. After ending the call, the family discussed the opportunity with the careful attention Alexander had learned to apply to decisions affecting both children. Sophie's gift deserved recognition, but not at the cost of her childhood or normal development. "I want to do it," Sophie said finally, "but only if it helps other kids like Ethan find their voices, and only if we can keep working together afterward." Ethan nodded eagerly. "We're a team. Sophie helped me learn to talk, and now we can help other kids together." Their mature approach to the opportunity impressed both adults. These children, who had been brought together by therapeutic necessity, had developed into partners whose combined insights could benefit families nationwide. That afternoon, as Alexander worked in his home office reviewing Sterling Pharmaceuticals' quarterly reports, he found his attention repeatedly drawn to voices from the garden, where Carmen was helping the children plant vegetables in raised beds designed to accommodate Sophie's mobility needs. The scene, visible through his window, showed a family engaged in ordinary domestic activity that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. His intercom buzzed with a call from Victoria Chen, his executive assistant who had adapted admirably to Alexander's transformed priorities and family responsibilities. "Alexander, the mayor's office called about the playground proposal. They want to meet with Sophie and Ethan next week to discuss implementation in the city's new recreational development project." Alexander smiled, unsurprised by the rapid response to their design submission. Sophie and Ethan's collaborative work combined artistic vision with practical innovation in ways that impressed everyone who reviewed it. "Schedule the meeting," Alexander instructed. "And Victoria, contact our legal department about establishing a foundation specifically for accessibility. Innovation projects. I want to ensure Sophie and Ethan have resources to continue this type of work." The decision felt natural, using Sterling Pharmaceuticals' resources to support the children's collaborative efforts while creating sustainable funding for projects that honored Elena's memory through service to others. That evening, as had become their routine, the family gathered in the living room, where Alexander and Carmen shared parenting duties, while Sophie and Ethan worked on homework that increasingly involved joint projects reflecting their complementary skills. "Alexander," Carmen said during a quiet moment while the children researched presentation materials for their upcoming conference opportunity, "I've been thinking about Elena lately." Alexander looked up from his own work, noting the peaceful tone in Carmen's voice when she mentioned her sister. A dramatic change from the pain that had once characterized any reference to Elena. "What about her?" Carmen gestured toward the children, absorbed in their collaborative research with the easy partnership that had developed over months of working together. "She would be so proud of them. not just their individual accomplishments, but how they've learned to support each other. Alexander followed her gaze, seeing Elena's son and Elena's niece creating something beautiful together, healing that honored their lost loved ones while building foundations for their own futures. Elena always believed that love finds a way to connect the people who need each other. Alexander replied softly, watching Sophie and Ethan's friendship develop, seeing how you've helped me learn to be a father again. I think she was right. Carmen nodded, her expression peaceful. Miguel used to say that family isn't just about blood relationships, but about people who choose to care for each other through difficulties. We've become a family that Elena and Miguel would both recognize and approve of. The conversation was interrupted by Sophie's excited voice. We found statistics about playground injuries and accessibility requirements. Our design could prevent accidents while including twice as many children as traditional equipment. Ethan looked up with equal enthusiasm, and we found pictures of playgrounds in other countries that use similar concepts. We're not just making something new, we're adapting good ideas that already work. Their research approach demonstrated the maturity and thoroughness both children had developed through their collaborative projects. More importantly, it revealed their shared commitment to creating solutions that served others rather than seeking recognition for its own sake. As bedtime approached and the children prepared for sleep, Alexander found himself standing in Elena's former art studio, now a creative workspace that honored her memory while serving their living family's needs. Carmen joined him, both adults, comfortable with the shared contemplation that had become part of their evening routine. "Do you ever wonder what Elena would think of our arrangement?" Carmen asked quietly. Alexander considered the question seriously. Over the months, he and Carmen had developed a relationship that honored their mutual love for Elena, while acknowledging their different needs and personalities. They were partners in parenting, companions in grief, and collaborators in creating family stability, but not romantic substitutes for their deceased spouses. I think Elena would be grateful that her son has found his voice, her sister has found security, and her family has found each other, Alexander replied honestly. The form our relationship takes matters less than the love and support we provide for each other and the children. Carmen nodded, understanding the distinction. Miguel always said that love expresses itself in whatever form serves the people who need it most. We've created something that works for all of us. The next morning brought news that would cement the significance of their transformed lives. Dr. Marsh called with updates from the pediatric therapy conference. Sophie and Ethan's presentation proposal had been accepted for the keynote session, with requests for follow-up workshops and training materials development. More importantly, 3 families had already contacted Dr. Marsh, requesting consultation about implementing Sophie's peer-to-peer approaches for their own children facing communication challenges. The ripple effects of Sophie's gift were expanding beyond their immediate family to benefit children they would never meet. "We're going to help lots of kids," Sophie said with satisfaction as they discussed the conference opportunity over breakfast. "Just like you helped me," Ethan added, his clear, confident voice a testament to how far he'd come from the silent boy who had first encountered Sophie's patient encouragement. As Alexander prepared for work that morning, he paused to observe the scene in his kitchen, Carmen packing healthy lunches while discussing the day's activities with children who chattered excitedly about school projects and weekend plans. The domestic tranquility felt both natural and miraculous, evidence of healing that honored the past while embracing the future. 6 months earlier, Alexander Sterling had been a cold, isolated man whose wealth couldn't purchase the connections he desperately needed. Today, he was a father figure to 2 remarkable children, a family partner to his wife's sister, and a man whose resources served purposes beyond profit margins and corporate expansion. Elena's son had found his voice through Elena's niece's patient encouragement. Elena's sister had found security through Elena's husband's support, and Elena's family had been reunited through the mysterious forces that connect people who need each other across time, circumstance, and tragedy. The transformation that began with a chance encounter between a disabled girl and a mute boy had evolved into something larger, proof that healing comes through connection, that family transcends traditional boundaries, and that love finds ways to honor the past while creating hope for the future. As Alexander drove to work, his phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Dad, Sophie and I finished our space painting last night. It shows Earth from the moon, with all the people below working together, even though they can't see each other. Mom would have liked it." Alexander smiled, understanding that Elena's greatest legacy wasn't the artwork she'd left behind, but the love that continued to connect her family through the remarkable children who carried her memory forward into a future filled with possibility, healing, and hope. The cold millionaire, who had once fainted at learning a disabled girl's last name, had discovered that sometimes the people who seem furthest from our lives hold the keys to our deepest healing. In helping his son find his voice, Sophie Martinez had given Alexander Sterling something far more valuable than any business success. She had given him back his family, his purpose, and his understanding that love never truly ends, but finds new ways to express itself through the connections that matter most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.